Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today, we're going to discuss 4 years of war in Ukraine and what that has meant for Europe. We're also going to discuss the newly sworn-in Dutch government under Prime Minister Rob Jetten and its implications for European politics. Then we'll turn to a conversation with Jude Blanchette from the RAND Corporation to discuss the state of play in Europe's China policy. We hope you enjoy the show.
Max, we are recording this episode on the 4th anniversary of Russia's war in Ukraine, which is kind of wild to think it's already been 4 years. There's been a lot of conversations in Europe over the past few months on how to best support Ukraine for now, but also for the many months to come, as we're not really seeing a lot of resolution on the horizon. Looking back on those 4 years, what's your sense of how things have evolved, both on the Ukraine side, but also, obviously, importantly, on the Europe side?
Yeah, look, I think this anniversary it's one to sort of reflect back on how this war has proceeded. And we just did a podcast and a live event for our Russian Roulette podcast, reflecting on 4 years of this war, which goes into more of the Russia and Ukraine side. But I think it's worth reflecting how Europe has changed. And I think if you go back to the beginning of the war, I think there was a sense like, oh my God, European unity is going to crack. Europe's not united. This is, Europe is feckless and weak and yada, yada, yada. All the same stereotypes that you hear in characterizations that you hear presently. I write a lot of stuff that I think is, probably proven wrong by history as it goes. But I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post in June of 2022 as all this chatter about how European unity was going to crack, the refugees, the increase in energy prices, and said, no, European unity is not going to crack. It's going to stay united. And I think that's really been borne out. As much as we talk about how there's differences in threat perception in Europe, where the Estonians are freaked out and maybe those in Portugal are not. That's totally true and understandable. Yet there is this sort of shared sense that Europe is at risk. If you look at polling done by the European Council on Foreign Relations, there is this sort of shared sense that Europe needs to defend itself, that Europe is at risk. And what we have seen from the war in Ukraine is actually tremendous European resilience. When there was a massive energy crisis, when the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines were exploded, Europe across the bloc has suffered massive increases in energy prices, and there hasn't been this sort of rush to turn back to Russian gas to just end this war, much like we kind of saw after 2014. There has actually been real unity. And, it may be ironic that I'm saying there's real unity at a moment when Europe's efforts to finalize the financing for Ukraine, a loan package, and do a 20th sanctions package is being held up by Viktor Orban primarily, but also Fico. I think one thing we have to note is that, Europe they're full of democracies, right? And so the idea that you're going to get 27 members always united and that, okay, if you get 435 million of the 450 million Europeans to be basically in favor of something, that's pretty close to unity. And I do think that what we've seen is that Europe has found a way. They're going to find a way around Hungary's present blocking. They will figure out a way, just as they figure out a way to do this loan back in the fall. And so I think what we've seen is a real determination on the part of the EU to move forward. We've seen the EU now get involved in defense and security, and it did so very early on in the war with the European Peace Facility providing money for arms for Ukraine. And Europe is now emerging as the main financial backer of Ukraine.
And just for context, in case some of our listeners aren't quite sure what it is exactly you're talking about, Max, Hungary had at this big council summit in December agreed not to block this big loan that 24 member states were agreeing to take on together. Basically, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic did not want to take part of the loan. So what they did is they agreed to not block it, but they won't take any of the financial fallout if there's a problem with it. And what we just saw is Hungary going back on this quote-unquote promise not to block it. Obviously, it's complicated. There's a lot of domestic dynamics.
They claim that Ukraine has turned off the oil pipeline to them that brings oil from Russia. But, the Russians are assaulting Ukraine's energy infrastructure. So the Ukrainians are like, well, the Russians did it. But, it's also Viktor Orban is in the midst of an election.
And Ukraine has really been one of his battle horses.
Yeah.
Like he's been very anti-Ukraine, hoping that this gets him a lot of votes, which we'll talk about in another podcast. It's not quite working out, but he is a little bit grasping at straws. And this blockade of the loan and the sanctions is one of those things. Although we should say the sanctions hang up for Orban, that's not new. He's done this many times and then he ends up letting it go, but he always tries to get concessions for it.
I mean, just the mere fact, though, that we're talking about a 20th sanctions package, in that, if you go back to 2022 when it came to sanctions, the American narrative about sanctions against Russia after 2014, which I think was true, was that we had to pull the Europeans along. It was Merkel and others were like resisting. They didn't want to sanction Russia. And then it was only until MH17 exploded over the Donbass in the summer of 2014 that Europe flipped. And that was the presumption going into this war that sanctions could never be that strong because Europe would be reticent. And then what actually happened was a total reversal of that. It was the Europeans with Draghi freezing Russia's assets. Europe pushed for banning Russian oil in May of 2022. And the Biden administration was like, oh my God, that's like too much. So we've seen Europe actually be very strong there. I think maybe one thing as we think about where this war is headed, and I think this is really important because the Europeans, I think, have assumed that these peace talks are real, that are taking place between the Ukrainians and the Russians and the US and others, when really all that's happened over the last year is that the West has been negotiating with itself. And then finally, it's been a year and now there's, I guess, some trilateral talks that have gone nowhere. I think the expectation of most Russia hands is that these talks are going absolutely nowhere. Russia thinks it's winning this war, thinks it has the advantage. And I think where Europe needs to start planning and thinking is that this war is going to continue. And Europe is going to be on the hook to finance this war. So the loan that it just did, that's not a one-off. It's going to happen probably again and again and again. We'll probably be having this conversation next year on the 5th anniversary of this war. And Europe can afford this. Europe can afford this and needs to just get ready for that and prepare for that. And, what you see is anytime there's any sort of spinning of the merry-go-round on the negotiations, you see the stock prices of European defense companies go down because, oh my God, there might be peace. European defense companies need to start making these investments into their production facilities because the war is going to continue. And if it stops, then Europe actually has a real crisis, which is that the Russian military machine is not going to turn off and they're going to have to continue to accelerate their own rearmament. So unfortunately, that's where we're headed right now. And I think most European leaders probably get that, but there's been a lot of distractions with this reassurance force coalition of the willing from the UK and France, which has sort of no chance of ever being inserted, and a lot of focus on negotiations that are going nowhere.
And the critical element here, you said Europe can afford this. That is true. And at the same time, Ukraine cannot afford to go without this money because it's not just that some of it would be used for armaments and really important weapons, etc. It's also that it literally keeps the Ukrainian state afloat and paying salaries for people who are working in the government and making sure that this infrastructure that Russia keeps bombing can actually be repaired and then send it to Hungary. All these things are critical for Ukraine.
What Europe is doing now for Ukraine and what the US was doing as well is what the US did for Europe ahead of World War II or during World War II with Lend-Lease, probably also during World War I with JP Morgan, sort of financing the French and UK war efforts. That is absolutely critical. And maybe it's a good point to sort of pivot that there's been a new leader that has now taken the helm in a very important European country in the Netherlands. Rob Jetten of the party D66 is the new prime minister, and it's an interesting coalition. What do you think of it?
I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I'll try to be succinct. One, it's a big deal. Rob Jetten is young. He's 38. He's the first openly gay prime minister in a country that is known to be very liberal on social issues. There's no great way for me to explain. It feels to me like this coalition is a little bit of a bait and switch for Rob Jetten because he campaigned with a very positive message, like we can do things. We don't have all these limits. I mean, there are limits, but and it was a message that would have been a little more appropriate for a center-left coalition. Now, As we know, the Netherlands has become one of the most ungovernable countries in the European Union.
The elections are insane.
Yeah, and that means there's 42 million parties, which also means that forming a coalition that was center left for him in the parliament turned out to be impossible on the math. Or it would have required 8 different parties, and he couldn't get there. What that means, though, is that we're in a situation where the coalition agreement has this very pro-EU message and promises to be forward on defense investments, on, really being tough on Hungary and Slovakia when they're being Eurosceptic, all these things. And at the same time, it has a fiscal policy that is very constrained and announces a lot of cuts. And one of the partners in government is Mark Rutte's former party, VVD. And this is a party that's been in power for a very long time and has always been a restrainer on the European stage, especially when it comes to big joint investments. So I'm struggling to see. I think it's great for Rob Jette, and I have hope that he can implement a lot of this, at least on the European ambition. I really struggle to see in practice how we do this when one of the main parties in his coalition is one that has always held back the leash on big European action.
Well, I totally appreciate your concern, and I think it's totally fair. I do think that sometimes it's about what matters. What are the issues that are really animating these various parties? And, we didn't actually see the Netherlands under the previous government. Under Geert Wilders was the main party, and you had a civil servant sort of picked out of nowhere to become the prime minister. It was something out of that, like the movie Dave or something. Someone was sort of picked up and suddenly you're a world leader meeting with Zelensky and other world leaders. But we didn't see the Netherlands be that obstructive. And I think where we are now is Jette really campaign on a pro-EU message. I think he can still do that. I think there's certain compromises on probably the domestic and social issues that a lot of these parties really care about. I mean, one of the main issues in the Dutch election was nitrogen, i.e., cow poop, because agriculture is such a big part of their economy. But this wasn't like an election that many of the parties are animated by like the big pan-European issues. And I do wonder if this is sort of something we're going to start seeing in the future, where you start having kind of a center-left party, a centrist party that's pro-EU, recognizing that in order to really govern, that maybe the safer coalition is with kind of one of the far-right anti-migration parties, and that you sort of neutralize one of the right's big issues. And so we'll see how this plays out. In some ways, they're pursuing a little bit the Danish model, the Danish Social Democrats, trying to sort of neutralize migration as an issue for the right. We'll see, and maybe that creates space for a more pro-EU posture. I think in general, though, having a prime minister of the Netherlands, from a modern perspective being Eurosceptic, but having a prime minister now that has supported a European army and did so during the election campaign, I think is very interesting. And I think at the very least means that if there's a push for a new direction for Europe, the Dutch aren't going to be the obstacle. And that is something that we've seen, Rutte play in the past as sort of the tisk kind of more Merkel than Merkel when it came to European spending.
Yeah, I think that's the tension I see here and that's the last thought I'll say on this is I do think it's good to have a Dutch prime minister that will be rhetorically very supportive of big EU level policies, things that are really needed, especially as competitiveness, conversation, et cetera, keeps picking up. I do think we have seen pro-EU rhetoric from a Dutch prime minister before that did not translate in actual support for those actions. And Rutte has always been able to hide behind the reputation of the Netherlands as a pro-EU country. So that's my main point is I want to see what that's going to look like in practice and not just the rhetoric.
You're just Belgian and, those
Yes.
mean Dutch. I think that's maybe a good segue to our conversation with Jude Blanchette. Chancellor Friedrich Merz is going to be headed off to China, and there's much to talk about when it comes to Europe and China. We are thrilled to welcome Jude Blanchette back to the Europhile. Jude is the Distinguished Tang Chair in China Research and the inaugural director of the RAND China Research Center. He is a leading expert on China's political landscape and focuses on expanding RAND's focus on China's domestic issues. including social, economic, demographic, and environmental challenges, as well as the non-military aspects of competition with China. And he was previously our colleague here at CSAS when he held the Freeman Chair in China Studies. Jude, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you back.
It's great to be here, Max. Thank you.
Now, Jude, you were in Munich, as I was as well. You were also in Berlin last week. What is sort of your impressions right now of where Germany and Europe are when it comes to China policy? And maybe just to set the scene, I think there's a lot of questions about where the United States is when it comes to China, where the Trump administration is. I think there was a lot of expectation that there would be real room for cooperation between Europe and the United States on a very hawkish policy toward China. It seemed that that's where the trajectory of Europe's approach toward China was going in a more hawkish direction. We saw some of that during the Biden administration, and that was going to be an area where Europeans were going to be like, all right, let's get tough with the Chinese, but that hasn't really materialized. So where do these things stand? Maybe if you could give sort of a scene setter.
Well, you'll have thoughts on this as well, Max. I was struck by 2 years running how China was, of course, an important thread throughout MSC discussions, but really wasn't the main focus at all. Last year, of course, was Vice President Vance's speech, which, you could see jaws on the floor as European audience members processed the speech. Of course, this year, the MSC was held in the context of Trump's threats against Greenland, a very active last few months of U.S. foreign policy. So going into this MSC, China, again, as we'll talk about, threads throughout so many discussions, but not with the sense of profound weight that does the United States did. And of course, this year, everyone was looking to see what signals were going to come out of Secretary of State Rubio's speech. Rich Colby also spoke at MSC. So that was just the first, I think, most notable observation on China. Even Wang Yi's speech last year and again this year, which happened immediately after Vance last year, Rubio this year. I mean, the main room clears out when Wang Yi comes in. And his speech this year felt a little bit like a copy and paste from last year's, trying to set a contrast with the United States of, again, we, China, upholders of the international order. U.S. represents chaos. We represent predictability. U.S.-China policy, as you rightly indicate, matters here because that is the main trajectory setter, is the relationship with the United States and China. And other powers, including Europe, in some ways have to navigate around that. It was striking this year at MSC, you heard a much more muted rhetoric from the administration on China in the speeches. Obviously, that's because the U.S. is gearing up for a presidential visit. Trump will be going to Beijing in April. There is a don't rock the boat vibe coming out of the White House right now across the board. Europeans are struggling to understand with precision what the U.S. approach to China is. I'll admit I'm in something of a similar boat here. We can talk about specific policies from the administration on China, but crystallizing this into a strategic approach to China is difficult. Right now, much of the strategy seems to be about achieving a deal in April around things like soybean purchases, maybe a trade on tariffs, maybe some inbound investment from China into the United States. There's rumors of a potential JV between U.S. automakers and Chinese automakers, potentially a trade on thinking about Taiwan dynamics. That matters here, and I'll wrap up this overly long answer right now, but that matters here because in some ways, what you're seeing from the United States is a rethink of its approach to China across trade, technology, investment, moving away from what appeared to many of us to be more of a consensus in the United States about a more restrictive approach to economic and trade and technological relations with China potentially being loosened. And that matters here because Europe is in its own way having to navigate both trying to de-risk from China in ways where there's an over-reliance and a vulnerability from its relationship with China. But on the other hand, Europe, it cannot de-risk from the first and second largest economies of the world, the US and China. So I think Europe is trying to figure out its own way as it sees the United States sort of meander towards a rethink of its own approach.
I think here in Washington, at least over the last decade or so, I think we have seen ourselves as sort of the geopolitical leaders recognizing that China is a real challenge to the United States, the rules-based international order, and that China needs to be confronted, and sort of viewed ourselves as trying to sort of drag our European allies along to sort of reckon with this threat and challenge. I think some of that might have been overstated. I think oftentimes the Europeans were basically aligned with us on a lot of issues. We sometimes, Washington and New York, are not always on the same page. And I think we're seeing that in the Trump administration. We saw that in the first Trump administration. But I'm curious now, with the US not sort of trying to quarterback, it seems, a European approach to China, are you seeing any coherence from Europe? How are you seeing Europe interact here?
Yes, would be my answer to that. I think in some level, just abstracting this, I see the EU-China relationship as being defined by a three-way squeeze that European leaders at the member state level, and then, of course, in Brussels, are having to navigate. First is the fracturing of the transatlantic relationship matters here. As you say, I think it is fair to say that oftentimes it was the United States, especially over the last few years, really trying to pull Europe towards a more competitive posture vis-a-vis China. Not completely, because of course, in some ways, the change in approach here started to happen in 2015, 2016, where you start to see Europe step up on investment screening mechanisms as they became worried about some of these big inbound investment pushes from China in some sensitive industries. Of course, China's ongoing and in some ways elevated support for Russia in the war against Ukraine has exacerbated tension. So this wasn't all a pull from the United States, but I think we also can't underestimate that that mattered. And as you see the transatlantic alliance fracture, to some extent, yes, I think that will, in the very near term, that will mean a bit less alacrity from Europe on some more competitive postures vis-a-vis China. But most importantly, that fracturing of the transatlantic relationship also means that collectively we're just going to be able to do less vis-a-vis China. Take rare earths, for example. It is notable that the one area that the White House has outstretched its hand and really lent into the idea of a coalitional approach to China is on rare earths and magnets, because it recognizes the United States just can't do this alone. A year ago at MSC, there was discussion of lots of initiatives that I think Europeans were hoping to do with Trump in that same vein of coalitional approach. And really now that's almost completely atrophied. And it will be, Europe doing its own thing vis-a-vis China, and then the United States episodically doing its own thing. But the rare earth vulnerability shows how really the path forward for both the US and Europe is working together on these. And I think we just have to recognize that structurally that's going to diminish. So that's the first squeeze. Second is China's deepening role in Russia's war machine. This is, in some sense, you could say this has been a constant, that China has been there for Russia since the beginning. But actually, I think in important ways, you've seen German intelligence last year showed that they think 80% of Russia's sanctions circumvention is now running through China. You're seeing Chinese firms, as some have said, almost single-handedly supporting Russia's drone production by shipping engines mislabeled as industrial refrigeration equipment. China's exported 350,000 miles of fiber optic cable to Russia. We're seeing Chinese satellites assisting the Russians in reconnaissance. So that, of course, affects Europe's relationship with China and moving forward. And then the final, though, is just China's industrial machine has ramped up significantly since COVID. Again, I think we all went into a bubble. We lost sight of what China was doing in terms of industrial capacity. And then it just sort of exploded out of COVID across a range of industries, robotics, EVs, green tech. And that is really, especially for countries like Germany, really starting to hollow out their manufacturing sector. The response to this, if we were looking at a snapshot of today, I think you could say is divided and not sufficient to the challenge. That being said, and I'm very curious for your perspectives on this, I do feel like 2026 is going to be a bit of a hinge year for Europe. I think the absence of the United States as a reliable partner, coalescing with especially record trade deficits with China, employment effects of China's industrial machine really starting to hammer some European economies in a few days, to talk about a renewed golden age with Beijing. I think he's definitely going to be bringing up overcapacity. He's definitely going to be bringing up the rare earth choke point. The French are running the G7 this year. You're going to see them start to talk about global imbalances, which is code word for China, a think tank affiliated with the German government recently put out a call for a 30% across the board tariff on goods from China to try to address these imbalances. So proof will be in the pudding. And again, curious for your views on this, but I think the idea that we're going to see the same old play by Europe doesn't match some of the mood that I'm picking up.
Yeah, maybe just a quick thought, and then I'll turn it over to Etienne. I think that's right. I think one of the challenges that Europe has had over the last year is just a bandwidth issue where, the major focus has been Ukraine, Russia, Trump, how to kind of navigate the US sort of pulling back from Ukraine, trying to prevent sort of a massive rupture with NATO. So the European Council summits last fall, when Denmark had the rotating chair of the European presidency, was very Ukraine focused. How does Europe fund Ukraine? So the European Council summit in December was about that. That you're starting to see a shift to then now focus on competitiveness, Draghi report, which is also about China. And I think that's going to continue. So I agree with you. I think they haven't really been able to kind of really focus on the China file because, as you noted at Munich, this last Munich security conference, the one before, China was sort of like not a central focus, but on the economic side of the house, it clearly has been. And so I think that is going to creep into the conversation much more this year as Europe sort of picks up the competitiveness focus on trying to protect its economy, increase competitiveness, deal with China, handle, whatever happens with US tariffs. And so I think you're right. But I think 2025, they just didn't have the bandwidth.
It's interesting to hear you say, too, that it's not your sense that Merz is going to Beijing ready to roll out the red carpet all over again. I mean, from on one side of Europe, especially from France, we're hearing a lot of pretty sturdy commentary about how Europe has to also hold its own and not do what they've done before. But the way Merz has talked about China recently and what we know also of German industry pressures and how the pressure they're also trying to exercise on EU policymaking, I think there were some questions floating around in the last month or two about whether we could be, or Europe could be, walking into the same trap again and trying to rebalance towards China. So it's interesting to hear your sense of it. I'm curious then from the other side, or maybe looking at both sides fairly equally, we know the kind of leverage that China holds over European economies and industries, especially on rare earth, things like this. But what kind of leverage are we looking at on the other side? Are there things that Merz can bring to bear, or Brussels as a whole can bring to bear in the relationship? And is China open to making decisions that would potentially rebalance a little bit in a way that opens the economic or opens the European market back again? Because it also has to de-risk from the United States itself.
Yeah, just quickly on Germany, I think there is a division on how to move forward here. I think there are some companies who are getting squeezed by China, but nonetheless trying to fight for market access in China and or in China for China, or joint ventures where they're then exporting from China into the European market. That's all on the table. So I don't think this means that Merz is going to go over there and read Xi Jinping the Riot Act. So I think there are still countervailing pressures here. But one of the dynamics that I think could make this different this time is you're also just seeing unsustainability of some of these countries' relationships with China, given the industrial, economic, technological model that China is quadrupling down on right now. The hollowing out, which has been a trend, is now just, I think, really, really ramping up in undeniable ways. China's exports to the world are surging to record levels. You're seeing the yuan, the renminbi falling 20% against the euro since, mid-2022. I think something like 8% over the last year, which of course compounds trade imbalances, erodes the effectiveness of EU trade defense instruments. So there's an unsustainability of the approach here. And I will just say, as many people have been asking over the last couple of months, what is China willing to buy from us? What is China willing to buy from Europe? There's a lot of what China wants to sell into these markets, but it is a pure import substitution approach from China, where they want to be making everything domestically. They might want to buy some services, but they certainly don't want to buy manufactured goods. And that relationship of a state-dominated, state-subsidized industrial policy on steroids model with hyper competitive private sector firms who are able to scale up domestically because of the absence of foreign competition and then go out into global markets and sell at very competitive, if not under market price, while the country is unwilling to accept anything in imports from countries like that. That just isn't sustainable. And I think that's the political realization which is cresting across Europe. Now, 27 member states, a lot of them have different compositions of their relationship. So Hungary is making a different play than is Germany. Also, we have different views from France and Germany on how to deal with this. I think the Commission is taking some interesting steps and is continuing under von der Leyen's leadership to harden on China, but there's a ceiling of what you can do in Brussels. So this is not going to be perfect, but I think our traditional Washington snobbery about Europe, which I find frankly a bit tiresome, also I just don't think necessarily matches where we might be going. And final comment on that too, I just, the criticisms of Europe also don't necessarily land with me, because I think it is one thing for the world's largest economy with arguably one of the most potent militaries to be arguing about how you should conduct your relationship with China. It's just another thing for European countries to try to navigate their own path without having to calibrate their relationship with China and the United States. You know, Mark Carney's speech at Davos on middle powers going their own route. The problem with that speech is there just generally aren't that many truly middle powers. Even in Europe, there are not many middle powers. I think Germany and France might stand alone here, UK if we're lumping it in, but that's about it. So I have a deal of tolerance for how difficult it is for countries to navigate this.
I agree 100%. And of course, that Max Bergman's school of thought would agree as well, that the doomerism on Europe is quite tiresome. But another area that's interesting to me is you mentioned there's different approaches among member states, but I think we're starting to see a debate emerging as well in different approaches depending on the sector that we're talking about. For example, like Adam Tooze, are starting to talk about the environmental aspect of all of this and how basically on the green tech industry, we actually have to be more open to China's production because this is how we massively grow the way we can produce renewable energy. And I think that's something that is obviously very important in Europe, and they're on a path to this. And some of that industry has been decimated over the last 10, 15 years and has been acquired by China, et cetera. So there's a lot of interesting also sector by sector dynamics here.
In the abstract, I am completely open to that argument of however China got there, if they are producing goods that are from the energy transition that can help accelerate it, why don't we buy it? The problem is when I get closer to that argument and think of it in a lived reality, it becomes vastly more challenging. I think just the first area of hesitation I have on all this is building out dependencies on China comes at a massive, massive potential risk. And rare earths is just one example of this. Once China dominates a given supply chain for a critical input, it is not a pure commercial transaction. It comes potentially with significant geopolitical and political costs associated with it. So if China was a normal market actor and we were simply buying widgets from it, I would have no problem, even if, at the margin, these widgets were created through state, inducements and subsidies. The problem is it comes with massive political strings attached to it. So I think this is the argument. I grew up kind of a libertarian free trader, so this goes against every one of my instincts here, and it's hard for me to shake off my Hayekian roots. But this is the real challenge with opening up our auto sector to Chinese EVs, is we would just potentially building out vast dependencies on supply chains and end-use products that if we get into a tussle with China over something completely different, China has shown that it will weaponize those. Japan's a great example right now. Japan is having troubles getting its rare earth export licenses from China because of comments Prime Minister Takaichi made about Taiwan. So I think Adam is right in the abstract. I think just in real world geopolitics, we do that at great risk.
One thing I've been hearing more and more from different parts of Europe is that, okay, we sort of recognize everything you're saying about the Chinese economy and the Chinese businesses, dumping goods into our markets. But it is pretty clear that China has now become quite advanced in certain sectors. And maybe the thing that Europeans should do is try to do to China what China did to Europe and the US, where you invite in Chinese investment, Chinese firms to come into Europe, you force them to work with European firms, and you try to, basically make these Chinese companies become quasi-European companies, and you gain the benefits from their advanced technology and manufacturing skills. What do you think of the efforts to encourage Chinese investment into European countries? Is that something you see as, a potential interesting route, or do you have sort of doubts that the Europeans could sort of be as ruthless in some ways as the Chinese have been to European firms?
I mean, the answer to the second question is easy. There's no way Europe or the United States, frankly, who is considering something similar, is going to be as ruthless as the Chinese. So I think we can take that off the table. I mean, in some ways, what you're stating here is what Macron said at Davos, right? Which is the kind of, we want Chinese capital, but not Chinese competition. I think he said, bring us your FDI, bring us your key technologies, be ready to transfer some of those. We don't need just your exports. Yeah, look, I think it's 2026. We've got to face the reality that we're not going to put the genie back in the bottle on a lot of the advancements that China has made. It has spent literally decades in some cases, or certainly since Made in China 2025 came out in 2015, ruthlessly trying to build out advantages in a relatively small list of very, very important sectors. And we're now seeing the fruits of that. And I don't think we're going to find a time machine to go back. And also the cost for Europe and the United States of trying to replicate the technological ecosystem that's going to produce the same goods is prohibitively expensive. So in theory, I think it's a smart approach if it is done very carefully and is thinking about, obviously the security and economic implications of this. Like with BYD in Hungary, Chinese companies are willing to do this. They'd love to get into Europe, happy to set up production facilities and circumvent the tariffs. There are still employment effects of that, right? If BYD thrives in Hungary, that's going to put further downward pressure on the European auto industry. So at some point, you do have to make, I'm afraid, some protectionist decisions on whether or not you want to have some of these industries survive or not. I also, Max, you mentioned the Draghi report. I think part of this can't just be a barrier discussion. I think that, again, violating my libertarian neoliberal views on trade, I think there has to be some of that erection of barriers. There also has to be a run faster component, and that is certainly the case with Europe, more so than the United States. And so I think part of this also has to be a radical approach towards de-red taping and deregulation that is going to make Europe a much better ecosystem for innovation than it is now. Von der Leyen has been talking about trying to create a big, deep, liquid Europe-wide capital pool. I mean, Max, I was struck this year by the prominence of European defense companies at MSC, banners being hung in the square there of European defense companies. I talked to someone in the defense M&A space in Europe who said already really starting to see some capital move in here, in part because the capital is not only going to sort of rearmament, but also technology, and the two intermingle there. So I think as a standalone, just thinking the Chinese FDI is going to solve this riddle, I think is a siren song. But I think as a part of an overall competitive approach that, yes, thinks about some restrictionist measure and blunt the effect of, I think, some of the more damaging Chinese, beggar thy neighbor, import substitution policies. Yes, I think there needs to be some really smart security perimeters put around that. And then, of course, I think there needs to be if anything, as much a wake-up call in innovation capacity, put as much thinking into that as they're putting into tariffs.
Let me just ask you about Russia and Ukraine, because on the one hand, this has sort of been a side issue for most of, I think, the European conversations with China, I think pre-2025. The big shift that I see is that you now have two Baltic leaders that now have very senior positions in the European Commission. Kaja Kallas is the High Representative for Foreign Policy and Security. Andreas Kubilius, who's the former Lithuanian Prime Minister, who's the EU Defense Commissioner. But at the EU-China summit, it seemed like there was a much bigger push on the Europeans to say, hey, we want to have a good relationship. Your support for Russia and its war against Europe, effectively, that you need to tone that down. That didn't seem to go well. Do you think there's anything that the Europeans could do to change China's approach to supporting Russia? Do they need to make this more of a priority? Or is this just sort of a non-starter and it's more important to sort of turn to other issues? I guess, how do you see China thinking about this and approaching a support for Ukraine?
Wang Yi told callous last year that Beijing did not want to see Russia lose Ukraine, I think in remarks that came out. The amount of cost Europe would have to impose on China to get them to fundamentally withdraw support for Russia, I think is arguably too high compared to what Europe can and is willing to do. That being said, China's support for Russia, I think in some key ways, as we talked about earlier, has actually increased. I think China feels pretty comfortable with it. Frankly, it has felt pretty comfortable since February 2022 when, yes, it has taken 17, 18 rounds of sanctions from Europe. These matter at the margin. They haven't done anything to fundamentally shift its calculus. Anytime Macron or Starmer Merz goes to Beijing, they will bring this up. I think Xi Jinping will give a long lecture on the talking points China has used for the better part of 4 years, and then they will continue. Obviously, as you say, the two big distractions for Europe right now are Trump and Ukraine. Those are just meaningfully consuming an extraordinary amount of bandwidth and money. The Trump one, I think Europe is limited in what it can do. I think really the focus now should be, I think European leaders need to have much more of a unified front on this and a very specific set of requests from Beijing. Remember when Scholz went to meet with Xi Jinping, 3.5 years ago, you saw Xi Jinping come out of that meeting talking about how he didn't want to see nuclear weapons used. This is around the time that there were rumors floating that, Putin was flirting with this idea. So very specific requests from Europe that are backed up by a credible cost can yield some behavior modifications from Beijing. So I think as long as there is concerted pressure put on specific requests, it doesn't mean China's going to abandon Russia. I just don't think that's in the cards. But on whether that's, sanctions of avoidance, whether that's, Chinese satellites used in reconnaissance missions, whether that's, those are all things I think should be fair game, because otherwise Beijing is just happy to flow support to Russia until a settlement can come on Russia's terms. And China's got patience for that.
Jude, maybe one final question. How do the Chinese see Europe? Because it strikes me that, when you talk about before Chinese support for Russia and that they're just sort of continuing, they hear European concerns that I think have been elevated in intensity, maybe not from the member states, but from the EU itself. And it seems like those don't really have much of an impact on Chinese thinking. And so, or Chinese actions, Chinese policy. So how does China perceive of Europe and the European Union? And are there things that the Europeans should do to impact that perception?
At first is the Chinese have long had a pretty condescending view, and this applies to any U.S. ally and partner, which is that U.S. allies and partners have no indigenous approach to China other than what the United States makes them do. At MSC, I was in a China-related reception where a prominent Chinese former official spoke and basically said, now that things aren't so great with Trump, maybe we can expect Europe to do its own thing and have its own policy on China, which is more reasonable and rational. I don't think the Chinese realize how insulting and condescending that is. I think the Chinese see right now a region that is, for them, fortuitously divided, is navigating pressures of a fraying transatlantic relationship, which offers China many opportunities. I think China looks at Europe and obviously doesn't see a monolith, but different actors who they can play differently. You see a different approach from China towards Southern Europe than you do towards, Northern Europe. I would say, though, that in general, I don't get the sense the Chinese have a particularly sophisticated view of Europe. This is a classic problem for Chinese foreign policy in general. They tend to understand elites well, but they tend to have almost no visibility or, I think, real tactile sense of ground democratic opinion in countries. I think the Chinese, something we said earlier, I think they just kind of have the expectation that Europe will bend the knee. And my sense is, especially things like the export controls on rare earths, again, continuing support for Russia, China's really, it hasn't shown up in the data yet, but I think China has really significantly damaged its long-term interests across Europe over the last several years. And I think they'll pick up some wins here by virtue of a distracted Europe and a Europe that is dealing with the Trump administration. But I think there's a real ceiling to what China's going to be able to achieve here because of Chinese behavior over the last decade or so. What can Europe do? really should not underestimate the amount of leverage that individual member states and collectively Europe has vis-a-vis China. I think the biggest difference between China and us is China knows exactly where its leverage is and is willing to push on the carotid artery. I think we saw Europe get a sense of its leverage vis-a-vis the United States around the time of the Greenland threats. I think doing a better job of really patiently studying exactly where the pressure points Europe has on China, but most importantly, being willing to translate some of those into action. I think a lot of this is about potentiality, but I think at some point you've got to start really assuming some political cost to impose some of this on China. And I just say, as of yet, despite all the remarkably offensive stuff that China has done over the last 5 or 6 years, I think the response from Europe has been relatively muted.
Yeah, the Chinese approach to Europe in some ways sort of resembles the Trump administration's approach to Europe.
You said it, not me.
And I do think that, with Davos, it was sort of about the Europeans kind of stepped up and looked like they were the kid that the bully picks on, but suddenly the fist gets clenched. It looked like Europe was about to throw a punch, and then things sort of back down. And I do wonder if that sort of approach is probably necessary vis-a-vis China as well, if Europe is going to be taken seriously about its concerns in its interests.
Just one quick final point is an issue near and dear to your heart, Max, which is on defense rearmament and the future of Europeans' defense efforts. I mean, one of the structural realities that they're going to have to just deal with now is the fact that that $800 billion European initiative is based in many ways on supply chain vulnerabilities that trace back to China. So I think there's going to have to be a reckoning moment where, yes, you're still going to have to balance, but in general, if ever there is a moment for Europe to finally take the reins and make some painful choices that are going to certainly invite some near-term economic cost that comes with de-risking and angering China, almost everything I think Europe wants to achieve in terms of political security and sustainability are going to require basically confronting China in some way, because you can't allow China to have continued veto vote over your defense modernization through access to rare earths. And you can't let it decide that it's going to hollow out your industries because it will sell you stuff, but isn't willing to buy anything that you're selling.
I think that's a great point and a great place to end it. Jude, great to have you back. And we're going to have you back again on the Eurofile, because I think this year there's going to be a lot of Europe-China action, and we'll want you to come in and help us wade through the morass. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.